Well, welcome back, everyone. Here we are back again. Today, starting a new chapter, Chapter 7, Balancing Nationalism and Sectionalism. So, those two words, let's make sure we know what those are. So, we introduced the concept of nationalism really before this, but certainly at the end of the War of 1812. The sense of nationalism is that sense of extreme pride in the nation. But more specifically, nation means one thing, it implies unity. So it is this sense of national pride, yes, but it is also the sense of the United States being a united, unified nation, being one thing. And someone who was a nationalist would have believed in sort of nation first, state second. And they would have believed in national government over the states. They would have believed in the power of the national government, a stronger national government, kind of like how we talked about the Federalist in the past. Another way of looking at that is calling it nationalism. So we see this massive wave of nationalism after the War of 1812. And this is where we're going to see that showing up in a lot of different ways. We're going to see that today in this section, showing up particularly in some economic policies. Now, sectionalism, we briefly mentioned as well, that sectionalism means division based on regions, like north, south, and also west. So nationalism means, unified country, nation first, state second, whereas sectionalism means divided and region or even state first and country second, nation second. So those are opposite words. So what we're seeing here is a little bit of both. This is an age in which there is extremely heightened nationalism that we're going to see in a lot of different ways, but sectionalism never really goes anywhere. And interestingly, a lot of times the nationalist policies that we're going to talk about end up fueling a lot of sectionalism. So these things are kind of cyclical. It's it's an interesting and very curious situation. So today we're going to talk about economic changes in the wake of the War of 1812 and how those are nationalistic in a lot of ways, but also getting to how those create more sectionalism as well. So we'll see that kind of curious imbalance of nationalism and sectionalism here. We can characterize this era after the War of 1812. So all of this nationalism after the War of 1812 greatly characterizes this whole time period. So we call this time period after the War of 1812 the era of good feelings, which is a nice, warm, fuzzy name to describe this period of time. And it consists of, from the end of the War of 1812, so somewhere around 1814, 1815, to moving somewhere about 1830 or so. So this era of good feelings doesn't have definitive caps on it, but certainly maybe by 1825 or something like that. But the good feelings and what that's talking about. One, this also describes the presidency of James Monroe. So James Monroe is elected after Madison leaves office. So it is during his presidency, he presides over most of the era of good feelings, which one of the reasons we oftentimes don't remember a whole lot about Monroe, he's not as memorable, I would argue, as some other presidents, is because he's president during this era of good feelings in which things are pretty good. There's not really a whole lot of big crises in this era as we've seen in some previous ones. So that kind of makes him a little bit lesser known for kind of a positive reason. But the other reasons are things we should know about this era of good feelings, what these good feelings were. One, it has to do with the euphoric nationalism at the end of the War of 1812. We talked about how at the end of the War of 1812, there was this massive wave of nationalism, of patriotism, of pride in the country, of excitement in the country, this feeling that America was invincible, or maybe not invincible, but at least, exceptional in some kind of a way, that Americans were the most wonderful, virtuous, brave people that had ever been put on the earth. There was this sense of great pride. And there was a sense of just overall excitement and optimism about the future of the United States, that the future was boundless, and just anticipation of where the United States was going to go. That's part of these good feelings. And you see it in this nationalist even in images like this one, you can see the celebration here. You can see the American flag flying. All of that is part of this era of good feelings. The era of good feelings also has to do with the seeming lack of partisanship during the era of good feelings. If you recall, as a result of the War of 1812, the Federalist Party has fizzled out and is no more. So during this whole era of good feelings, all we have is Republicans, which makes it seem as if there is no partisanship. It makes it seem, at least on the surface, as if there is no disagreement agreement between parties, and as if, everybody's kind of on the same page. Now, of course, in reality, that is not true. There's going to be differences within the Republican Party, some of those quite divisive, but it at least seems on the surface. And a lot of people believed that, political parties was a thing of the past, that we've moved past that was something that happened right there at the beginning. We got over it, and perhaps we will never have political parties again. Now, of course, we won't see that. We're going to see a two-party system come back very, very soon. But for the moment, this lack of a two-party rivalry, this lack of seeming party bitterness and arguing between parties is part of the reason for this era of good feelings idea. It is also a reference to the economic prosperity of the era. The economy is going to be growing tremendously in these years and really transforming, leading to a lot of good economic prospects to a lot of people, a lot of economic growth and expansion, economic prosperity, and thus good feelings. And that's what we're going to focus on next, is the economic aspect of this. Why is the economy growing? What is changing about it? And why do we see this economic expansion? The main reason for that is because this is when we start to see the real true industrialization coming to the United States, the beginning of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution making its way to the United States. We have talked about how in the past, the United States really did not manufacture hardly anything on its own. The United States mostly produced raw materials, agricultural products, which were exported. But since the whole mercantilist system, it was a product of that mercantilist system. The United States did not manufacture really hardly anything. But the War of 1812 started to change that. The War of 1812 made some people realize that that was not a good thing, that was perhaps dangerous to be overly reliant upon Europe for manufactured goods. The War of 1812 had taught some people maybe some hard lessons in that, and people thought that's not a good thing because, the reason we got into that mess was because trade was being disrupted and all that kind of thing. We need to be more self-sufficient. This is also a product of nationalism, the whole patriotic euphoria, the idea that America was capable and needed to be able to be self-sufficient, that we shouldn't be relying on anybody else, that we need to be able to do this as just a matter of national pride and national efficiency. So we're going to see the beginnings of industrialization or manufacturing to the United States. So let's talk about what we mean with Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution overall, not just in the United States, but everywhere, the Industrial Revolution is this development of complex machines to do work, having stuff not, manufactured products not being made so much by hand, but being made by complex machines in large scale factories, being produced in large numbers, so mass production and mass distribution. So instead of having an individual person, an individual craftsman that is weaving cloth, we have, these looms, mechanized looms and machines that are doing that faster than humans can do and outputting that product in a very, very mass quantity. And the Industrial Revolution, of course, did not begin in the United States. It actually began in Britain, probably sometime in the late 18th century. And for a long time, didn't come to the United States for some of those reasons that we mentioned. Mercantilism, the old leftovers of the mercantilist system had been a part of that. But even when the United States gains independence and mercantilism is no longer an issue, even then industrialization is slow to come to the United States for a number of reasons. One of those being a lot of Americans simply did not want it. Think about people like Thomas Jefferson. If we think about Thomas Jefferson's vision of America, he envisioned this agricultural republic, an agrarian republic of a nation of small farmers tilling the land, and that agriculture should be the backbone of the American economy. He did not want industrialization for a number of reasons. One of them being he just saw industrialization, and a lot of people agreed with him, of just bringing too many problems, that when you industrialize, he looked at countries like Britain and said, we don't want to copy that. You get more people living in cities, and you get overcrowding, and you get people living in squalor and living in filth, and the cities are dirty, and there's pollution from these factories, and you've got children working in factories and people that are just toiling all day in these terrible factories, hemmed in by walls, doing the same job over and over and over, day in and day out. And to Jefferson, this is hard to, it just seems so crazy to say, but to Jefferson, it wasn't freedom, it was slavery. That was enslaving a person, which is odd for a slave owner to say that. But to him, punching the clock every day and, standing there in the factory and doing the same job day after day for someone else, for pennies for nothing was not freedom, and that wasn't what made up a true republic. So he didn't want it, and a lot of people agreed that it just was not a good thing. But that wasn't the only reason. There were others why the Industrial Revolution does not come to the United States. Jefferson's view of it, like I just mentioned. Sorry, I thought I took that out. But Jefferson's view that it would be harmful, that it was, contrary to this vision of an agricultural republic of free farmers, independent landowners working for themselves, not working for someone else, and saw industrialization as harmful and manufacturing as harmful. Another reason for the slow coming of industrialization to the United States was the fact that Americans just didn't possess the technology, did not possess the means to actually industrialize. Britain had monopolies on most things. Britain had a manufacturing hold on America. They were the ones to get it started, so they had the technology, they had the capacity to produce manufactured products much more quickly and therefore much more cheaply than any American businesses could do. So because they could do it faster and less expensively, that gave them kind of these de facto monopolies on things, and hard for Americans to compete with them. Just like today, it'd be hard to compete with, companies that have been in business a lot longer than you have and can probably do something with greater expertise than you can. It's not impossible, but it makes it difficult. And Britain is very secretive about their technology. They like having those monopolies. They guard, as any company would, as companies still do today, they guard what today we might refer to as intellectual property. They're not out there just telling everybody, here's how you build these machines. Here's the technology that does this. They keep that under tight control. They have actually a lot of very strict laws about all of that, and it was criminal to divulge any information about how these machines worked or how you did things, their whole methods. So it was very, very difficult for Americans to just essentially figure out how to actually do it. Now, the break in that comes with the person who is largely considered responsible for bringing industrialization to the United States was Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater was an immigrant from Britain who came to the United States, and he had actually memorized the technology. He had memorized in his mind exactly how all those machines worked, how all of the parts looked, how they were put together, how the factories were laid out. He smuggles what could not be smuggled on paper. He smuggles it in his brain and just memorizes how it looks like. Perhaps he had a photographic memory, but he's able to, with what he remembers, reproduce some of that technology in the United States, and is able to build some of the first and create some of the first factories, some of the first industrialized manufacturing in the United States. And the first way that industrialization is going to come to the United States is via textile factories. So the first industry that really exists, the first kind of modern manufacturing that we have is textiles, which is the same as how it developed in Britain. And textiles is, of course, cloth, spinning wool or eventually even cotton into fabrics, into cloth that could be used to make clothing and upholstery and a bunch of other things. So mechanized looms that wove that fabric together. And textile factories start to spring up mainly in New England. This is where industrialization takes off, is in New England. And that's the picture that you see here, with these, at the time, relatively small cottage-based industries, mostly textiles, starting to spring up in New England, where there was enough population to, make enough workers for these factories. There were geographical conditions that allowed this to be successful. And there was more capital, more money in New England, more cash flowing around in New England in order to invest and get these textile factories started. So the first wave of American industrialization begins in New England with those textile factories, and will always be for a long time confined really to the North. Now, this again has something to do with nationalism. I'm going to move myself up here so you can see this. Another way that we see nationalism show up is in economic policy. Now, we're going to see, in other words, the government taking an active role in promoting economic growth and economic development. That in and of itself is nationalism, because it demands national power. It demands power of the federal government, this idea that not only should the economy grow and be successful, but that the national government had a responsibility to actually enact policy, or maybe even in some cases to not enact policy, to do nothing, that would encourage economic development. That is a nationalist principle. And one of the big time nationalists of this day is Henry Clay. And Henry Clay is going to be proposing an economic program that is designed to do some of those things. So this program program is going to be called the American System. So we're looking at Henry Clay's American System. This is economic nationalism through and through. And you might remember Henry Clay as being one of the war hawks, and he is a big nationalist, always will be to the day he dies. He is fighting as a nationalist, among other things, very, very clearly. So he believes in a strong and powerful national government. Henry Clay's American System is designed to do a few things. It is designed to create a stronger economy, to encourage economic growth. And it is also about literally binding the country together, about bringing the country together. And you'll see when we look at what's in the American system, how it was meant to do that. That will make sense about binding the country together. So when we think about nationalism, when we think about unity, the American system is designed to kind of create some of that. Some of that unity, yes, is emotional and psychological, but he literally wants to bring the country closer together. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean we got to pull New York closer into Virginia, but you'll see what I mean here in just a second by binding the country together and how that has an economic purpose with all of this. So the American system, binding the country together, creating a stronger national economy, creating a stronger national government, and based on this principle that the national government must be strong and must go about doing those things, that it had a responsibility to do all of that. So here's the things that are in the American system and how Henry Clay wanted to produce those goals. One is a second bank of the United States. In other words, another national bank, or rather a recharter, a restarting of the national bank. Now, the national bank that we'd had in the 1790s had expired sometime early in the 1800s, and Republicans by that point had control of Congress and control of the presidency. And remember that Republicans had never liked that national bank to begin with. They had even argued that it was unconstitutional. And so they had, many years before this, allowed that national bank to expire and lapse. It has just been gone for a while. And what Henry Clay is proposing is that we resurrect it. We bring that back. So it is basically the exact same concept for the exact same purpose and would look extremely similar, almost identical to the bank that had been proposed and had been enacted in the 1790s. Now, remember, Henry Clay is a Republican, and before Republicans had stood against the idea of a national bank. But this is what I meant when I said a while back that the ideas that the Federalists stood for, strong national government, which by the way is nationalism, a national bank, all this kind of stuff, economic growth, they haven't gone anywhere. The Federalist Party has gone, but Republicans have like Henry Clay, have actually started to take on those ideas, have actually begun to support those ideas. The War of 1812 and some of the problems that the United States had during the War of 1812 had convinced a lot of Republicans like Henry Clay that there was benefit to stronger centralized power, and there was benefit to things like a national banking system, which is why he is proposing it. He sees this as important to stimulate the economic growth that they want, to stimulate economic development and make the economy and the country stronger and enhance the power of the federal government. He also is proposing protective tariffs as part of the American system. And if you remember, tariffs are taxes on imports and they raise revenue. But Henry Clay's tariffs are also protective tariffs. They are not just designed for revenue, that is part of it. But maybe a bigger goal here is protection. And they are meant to protect American businesses, American industries. Recall what we just talked about. The United States is beginning to manufacture, is beginning to get industrialized. And Henry Clay wanted to spur that. He wanted to support that. He wanted to make sure that that could happen and encourage that industrialization. So by raising the price of foreign imports, it was hopefully giving those new, just American manufacturers trying to get off the ground, giving them just a little bit of an edge. So these are protective tariffs. Now, up until now, you should notice that this looks very, very similar to something that we've talked about before. If you're thinking Hamilton, you're right. This very much resembles the economic thinking of Hamilton. It is almost a resurrection of Hamilton's financial plan, not exactly, but close. But it is based on the exact same concepts that the United States needed to move towards a more commercial economy, and that the national government should have an active role in promoting that by passing tariffs and having a national banking system. The third part of Henry Clay's American system is what we call internal improvements, or as we see over here, infrastructure. Internal improvements means transportation systems, which at this point in time means roads and canals. Now you see we have a little picture of a railroad, of a train down there. It does eventually mean railroads. At this exact moment when Henry Clay is first proposing this, it doesn't, because railroads railroads have not been invented yet, but it's not far behind. So roads, canals, eventually railroads, that is what we mean by infrastructure or internal improvements. And here's the part about literally binding the country together. The lack of transportation systems had been a problem during the War of 1812, and so that's part of what's being remedied here. But this is also about economic growth. This is about economic development. If we're going to manufacture things, we need to be able to get those manufactured products out so they can be sold. We need to be able to get raw materials and farm products to the north. We need to get their manufactured products to the west, to the south. In order to do that, we need to have roads. We need to have canals. We need to be able to move things quickly. We need to speed up trade and speed up travel and speed up communication. All those things must happen in order for the economy to grow. So that's about encouraging economic development, which is nationalism. But it's also nationalism because what Henry Clay was proposing was that the national government should pay for this, that the national government should be footing the bill and actually being the ones to build a lot of those internal improvements. So the national government should be taking on the responsibility of building roads and building canals and all those sorts of things. So it's nationalistic in that sense as well. Even the name American system is nationalism. This is the American system. This is about creating a stronger America. It really puts a nationalistic flair even on the name. Now, Henry Clay's American system certainly isn't without its critics, but most of it does get passed. We are going to see the Second Bank of the United States, or National Bank, rechartered, and that is going to reignite the same issues with the National Bank that we saw before. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We are going to see tariffs risen again. Protective tariffs are enacted. We will also talk later about the fallout from that, because the thing about tariffs is that some people like them, particularly business folks who are going to benefit from them, but other people do not. And we are also going to see lots and lots and lots of internal improvements built. However, most of those internal improvements are not going to be built by the national government or funded by the national government the way that Henry Clay was proposing. Most of it is actually going to be done by states and by private companies, but we are seeing a lot of that happening. Some major canals being built, like the Erie Canal, which has a tremendous effect on the economy and a tremendous effect on travel and trade, but most of that done by states or by the local or private companies. President Monroe actually vetoes most of the internal improvement measures, believing that it was in fact unconstitutional for the federal government to build roads and canals. So there were some limitations there, and there are still Republicans that are saying, we got to be more careful, and we can't just let the national government do whatever it wants. So we will look later at the fallout from those things. These are nationalistic programs, but they do tend to benefit some parts of the country more than others, which is why we are eventually going to see an increase in sectionalism. So we'll be looking at that part of it a little bit later.